And for me, I care more about like the process, and I think you kind of have a gut sense of when you work with somebody, whether this person is going to be somebody that if things go south, is this somebody that you want to go south with?
Hi, and welcome to the Story Rebel Masterclass. Today we're going to be talking about co-writing nonfiction books with Matty Dalrymple and Michael Ronn. So, Matty and Michael, you've both collaborated with each other, obviously, but also with other authors. Can you both talk about your collaboration experience? And Matty, why don't you go first?
Sure. So the two people I have collaborated with on nonfiction books are Michael and Mark Lefebvre. And I think it's interesting because I think it's an illustration that two people who are quite alike in their approach can work well together, and two people who are quite different in their approach can work well together. So I would say Michael and I are fairly alike in the sense that we're both like highly organized people. We have kind of a similar approach to our publishing and things like that. I would say Mark and I are more dissimilar because let's say project management wouldn't be Mark Lefebvre's preferred thing to do. He's certainly more than able to do it because he has organized these kind of collaborations himself. He has, played the project manager role, but that was one where like Mark was happy to have somebody else take on that role. So I think it's not that there are definite, yes, this will work and no, this won't work. It's that you need to think about those things ahead of time. Like it's just as possible that two people who have very similar approaches could run into problems as work smoothly together. And so, there were learnings on both those sides, but both of them can be successful.
And Michael,
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
also co-written fiction. Sorry for jumping in.
yeah. I work with Maddie on a few projects, and she's right. We both are very similar in terms of how we are organized and how we think. I also have collaborated on fiction. So my friend Justin Sloan, we wrote a novel together, and it was kind of like a one of those serendipitous moments where we both wrote fiction novels separately, like independently, that were very similar. And so we thought, oh, well, we were talking and we kind of had personality, we gelled really well. And we thought, well, our writing styles are similar. We like kind of the same things. We like a lot of the same books. What if we wrote a book together? And so we collaborated on a fiction series called Modern Necromancy, which was a 3-book series. And it was a really, really interesting experience, just learning how we work together collaboratively from a fiction perspective. So while I've collaborated with Maddie on nonfiction, I've also done the fiction as well.
Gotcha. And what do you, when you're looking for a collaboration partner, or I guess, kind of both of these seemed like they came about a little bit more serendipitously. What are you looking for? What sort of traits? Michael, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, I'm looking for somebody that's going to be on the same wavelength in terms of approach, income, all of that, because there have been people who've wanted to collaborate with me in the past who they are just extremely focused on the money and the growth part. And for me, I care more about like the process and connecting with readers and building a community and enjoying the the currency of ideas as opposed to being super mercenary on the money piece. So there are some people that are just not going to be a fit for me just from a personality perspective. So I think personality is good. Also, forgive me for speaking a little French, but I just don't want to collaborate with somebody that is going to be a pain in the ass. Right. And I think you kind of have a gut sense of when you work with somebody, whether this person is going to be somebody that if things go south, is this somebody that you want to go south with? And I think that's important. And I think it's important to follow your gut. But ultimately it's about interest and having fun and also being able to hit whatever outcomes you want, whether that be income or market reach. One of the reasons Maddie and I think we've collaborated so well is that we both have similar audiences. And so from a nonfiction perspective, it's really easy for me to send people to Maddie, right? I've had tons of leads and things that I send to her. She has, opportunities that she sends to me. And it just from a synergistic perspective makes a lot of sense. And so I would say personality and synergy are probably the two things that I would look for the most with a collaborator. Maddie, thoughts?
Yeah, I have found that my collaborations have mainly come about through being an active member of the writing and publishing community. And so the first book I co-authored with Mark Lefebvre, which was Taking the Short Tack, Creating Income and Connecting with Readers Using Short Fiction, came about because Mark had mentioned he had done a podcast episode on the Stark Reflections podcast about short fiction, and he had just made like a passing comment about ways you can use short fiction for reaching readers and creating income. And I, as a supporter of his podcast, sent him a note and said, "Oh, that sounded really interesting. Could you do a whole podcast episode about that?" Which he did. And then I further followed up and said, I think there's enough here for a book. And I also recognized that although at that point I had a lot of experience indie publishing short fiction, Mark had tons and tons of experience traditionally publishing short fiction. And so I also recognized that he was able to fill a gap there that I wouldn't be able to fill. And then the first book that Michael and I co-authored was because we were both at the Writer's Digest conference. We were speakers there, and we were kind of talking about the tips and tricks we'd picked up to, get speaking engagements, chatting over dinner. And when that dinner was done, we thought, whoa, I think we have enough to make a book here. And then, of course, once we had co-authored one book, we were like, guess what? Now we have a whole different set of, best practices about co-authoring that we can capture in a book. And then moving back to the kind of community theme, the second book I co-authored with Mark, which was the Podcast Guest Playbook, came about because I was like maybe 85% through what I wanted to say about podcast guesting best practices. And I had lunch with Mark at Author Nation, and I was telling him about this book. And as we were walking from the restaurant back to the conference, he said, "Oh, are you looking for a co-author on that?" And I said, yes, in fact, I am. I didn't realize it until just this moment, because I realized that what Mark had to bring there was lots and lots of great personal stories that illustrated the points that both of us wanted to make in the book. So I think it's just a theme that the more active you are in interacting with the members of your community, the more those opportunities present themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Matty, I wanted to ask you, you knew Michael well before you collaborated, but it sounds like you knew Mark more as a listener of the podcast, less than a friend. Is that correct?
Yes, at that point, I think that's true.
Yeah. So what was the difference in approaching those collaborations with somebody that you're like, okay, I know you well, I know how you work, versus somebody that you're like, okay, I know you at a distance, let's figure out how we work together?
Well, I would say one thing is that both Mark and Michael have pristine reputations in the writing and publishing space. And so the whole due diligence that we recommend you undertake before you embark on a co-author project was something that I had already done, just in the sense that I was interacting with them either one-on-one, like I was a member of their audience or I was one of their colleagues. And so I kind of felt like I had a good sense of Mark, both in terms of the expertise he would bring and just how he is as a person, by having been a longtime listener of the Stark Reflections podcast. And I also think it was slightly different because at that point, that was earlier in my career, and I felt a little more like I was asking a favor of someone in terms of participating, whereas as things went on later, it felt more like a true partnership. Because I felt like at that point I had gained enough followers and reputation and so on that it was a little bit more of an equal contribution in terms of what we were bringing in a marketing and branding point of view. But I just think that either by knowing a person through their presence, their publicly available presence, or knowing them in person as I came to know both Michael and Mark, I was able to see those markers that made me think that they would be good people to work with.